Are you ready to be surprised by God? As we explore the Book of the 12, also called the Minor Prophets, we will be thinking about the ways that God surprised the Israelites and how God can surprise us. The Book of the 12 Minor Prophets are a set of books that are often overlooked. This is in part because they're small compared to the mammoth prophetic books like Isaiah with its 66 chapters or Jeremiah with its 52. In comparison, even the largest books within the Book of the 12 look small at 14 chapters for Hosea and for Zechariah. And some books are as small as a single chapter, like Obadiah. Another reason these books are often overlooked is because their messages can feel foreign or even dangerous to us as Christians. How do we wrestle with the messages hoping for violence against Israel's enemies, like in Obadiah and Nahum, and the depictions of God as jealous, wrathful, and angry? In this class, we address these questions and share with you the continuing value of these books for us today. This course is structured in two ways. After this initial introduction, the course will have two main sections. Section 1 will explore the history, content, and theology of these books within the 12 by going book by book. Each session will cover 3 books at a time. Section 2 explores the major themes in the Book of the 12: justice and return, theodicy and hope, God's covenant promises, and the day of the Lord. As we explore each theme, we will examine their theological meaning in their time and for us today. The course will conclude with a class on how the 12 connects with the New Testament. We will discuss the surprising way God gave fresh interpretation to the 12 in this new context and how that helps us live today. I'll now turn our conversation over to Colin, who will share with us about the concept of a unified Book of the 12 to give you more insight into why we keep using this strange term.
Hi, I'm Colin Toffelmire. What on earth is the Book of the 12? Why does Beth keep using this term? I mean, we know about the Minor Prophets, the 12 prophetic books that follow Daniel in the Christian Old Testament, but why would anybody call these books the 12 books or the Book of the 12? Well, what we're talking about here is actually a scholarly view that developed sort of near the end of the 20th century. In the 70s, but really the 80s and 90s and into the beginning of the 21st century. And this scholarly view suggests that ancient writers and editors, in fact, meant these 12 minor prophets to be read as one large book. Why would somebody imagine that we're looking at one book and not 12 books? What are scholars seeing here? Well, a number of things come to mind. First of all, in all of the ancient manuscript traditions that we have, all of these books are found together on a single scroll. So we have a number of instances in the ancient world where we have different manuscripts that have some or all of the 12 minor prophets, but they're always found together. You never find Isaiah stuck in between Habakkuk and Nahum, for example. So these books are always found together on one scroll. Now, that raises a question. Is that because they belong together? Or is that just because of convenience, because of economics? In the ancient world, scrolls are very expensive. And so it is reasonably possible that the reason all of these books are found together is because it's too expensive to have an individual scroll for every single one of these books. Hosea maybe is long enough to have a scroll, or Amos or Zechariah might be long enough to have a scroll, but the book of Joel is 70-something verses long. The book of Obadiah is 21 verses long. They're not really long enough to have a scroll. So it's possible that it's because of just frugality, but also it's possible that it's because they belong together. So that raises the question for us. Another factor as we explore this question is, how do ancient people talk about these 12 prophetic books? So there's a book that is found in Catholic and Orthodox Old Testaments that is found in what Protestants call the Apocrypha or the Deuterocanon. And now this can be a little bit confusing. This book goes by a bunch of different names. Some people will call it Ecclesiasticus. Some people will call it Sirach. Some people will call it the Wisdom of Ben Sira, all the same book. But in that book, in the Wisdom of Ben Sira or Sirach, chapter 49, verse 10, there's actually a specific mention of the 12 prophets. May the bones of the 12 prophets send forth new life from where they lie, for they comforted the people of Jacob and delivered them with confident hope. It's important to note this is not a mention of a book of 12 prophets, but the 12 prophets are mentioned as one unified group. If you go back up a few verses, you'll notice that Ezekiel, for example, is mentioned separately. Jeremiah is mentioned separately. If you go down a few verses, you'll find that Nehemiah is mentioned separately. So many of the individual people that are mentioned in that chapter of Sirach are people associated with books of the Old Testament. And so this cues scholars to imagine the possibility that as we have all of these books always on one scroll, and when these prophetic books are mentioned, the 12 prophets are not named individually, but they're mentioned together as a group. This is becoming suggestive to us, is becoming an interesting thing that we should maybe think about a little bit more. So let's dig into what these ancient manuscript traditions looked like. So various ancient scrolls containing these prophetic books have been found, and they've been found in several different orders, which is really interesting. This tells us a couple of things. First of all, these short books were grouped together in all of our earliest sources, as I've already mentioned. That's one of the things this tells us. But the second thing this tells us is that the differences between these collections suggests the collections were edited intentionally and not haphazardly. They aren't just thrown together randomly. There's some logic to how they were edited. There are two kind of basic orders that you'll find in ancient manuscripts of the 12 minor prophets. The first, and this is the one that you're probably familiar with if you're used to reading these in your English Bible is in this order. This order comes from a tradition we call the Masoretic text, the Masoretic tradition. This is named after Hebrew scribes called the Masoretes, who maintained the documents that we now call the Old Testament in ancient times, particularly beginning, it's a little bit fuzzy, but probably around the 3rd or 4th century AD and down through the medieval period. The most famous manuscript associated with these scribes is something called Codex Leningrad. That's the complete Hebrew copy of the Old Testament that Old Testament scholars, Hebrew Bible scholars use to produce translations for your English Bible. This document comes from the medieval period, from around the 10th century AD. In that version of the Old Testament, the books we call the minor prophets, that we are calling the Book of the 12, occur in this order: Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. There's another order in the ancient world that comes from other versions of the Christian Bible. In the ancient world, because there were both Jews and Christians in many different cultures and many different geographic environments, it was pretty common for the Hebrew Bible to be translated into other languages. So the Old Testament is written in Hebrew, but it's translated into a variety of other languages as we go through history. Beginning in probably around the 2nd century BC, we especially have extensive translations of the documents we call the Old Testament into Greek. Sometimes people will use the shorthand, the Septuagint, to refer to these Greek translations. There's lots of different sort of subversions of them. They come in lots of different manuscripts that we've discovered in the ancient world. One very famous manuscript called Codex Vaticanus. Codex just means like a book, an ancient book with a cover, leaflets in order, a back cover, looks exactly like the books that you have in your library or when you go to your local library. And it's called Vaticanus because it's in the Vatican. Like that's where the book is located and that's where it's associated with. It was not probably created in Rome. It probably was created somewhere else, but it was stored in Rome for most of its history. And so we call it Codex Vaticanus. And of course we use Latin because, scholars like Latin, I guess. Anyways, the order in Codex Vaticanus is a little bit different than the order in the Masoretic tradition and the Hebrew tradition. So you'll see here the order in Codex Vaticanus in the Septuagint is Hosea, Amos, Micah, Joel, Obadiah, Jonah. And then the rest of the books are in the same order as the Hebrew tradition: Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Notice these sort of interesting shifts in order. So in the Hebrew tradition, Hosea, then Joel. In the Greek tradition, we go straight from Hosea to Amos. In the Hebrew tradition, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah. In the Greek tradition, Amos goes straight into Micah. So then Joel, Obadiah, and Jonah are grouped together in the Greek tradition. These books and their relationships to each other are important. They figure importantly in this conversation about whether or not we are looking at a unified, intentionally edited collection. These differences suggest that earlier blocks of material, for example, Hosea, Amos, and Micah, or Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, were maybe edited together later. Hosea, Amos, and Micah are all from the same period. Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi are all from the same period historically. Hosea, Amos, and Micah are all from the 8th century historically. That they might have originally belonged together, and then later they were pulled apart in the Hebrew order, and other books were inserted intentionally in between them. Now, what else can we say? Well, prophetic figures associated with the Book of the 12, interestingly, seem to be of very little interest. Jonah might be the exception here. But if you look at what we call the superscriptions, what's a superscription? So at the beginning of every single prophetic book, and this includes Jeremiah and Ezekiel and Isaiah as well, we have things that we call prophetic superscriptions. They're like little historical details, markers, that tell us when this prophet lived, to whom this prophet prophesied. So very often we have mentions, for example, of kings, or we have mention of dates. If you look at the beginning of the book of Ezekiel, it locates Ezekiel in the Babylonian exile. It tells us how long the people of Israel have been in exile in Babylon. So we can kind of get a marker in our minds about the historical period. When was Ezekiel alive and when was he prophesying? The interesting thing about a lot of the superscriptions in the book of the 12 is that historical details are present in some books and absent in others. So Hosea provides us with substantial historical detail. Joel gives us no historical detail. Gives us the name of the prophet, the name of his father, and nothing else. Amos gives us historical detail. It locates us in history. Obadiah gives us nothing. It just gives us the name of the prophet. So we find this sort of interesting feature as we work through these books, that some of them are giving us historical locations and some of them are not giving us historical locations. So all of this has led many recent scholars, beginning with people like Aaron Shart or James Nagelski. If you're interested in reading up on this yourself, James Nagelski is probably the best place to start. But lots and lots of other scholars. These people have traced extensive, what we call redactional work or editing work. The term redaction means editing. Redactional work through all of these 12 books. And the suggestion from many of these scholars is that not only is the 12 a collection, it's an intentionally edited single book. So let's look at certain specific features of unity. First of all, editorial catchwords. Between each of the various stages of editing, the scribes, the Hebrew scribes who put these books together, set common catchphrases at the endings and beginnings of these books to kind of clamp them together. That's actually what we call these sometimes. We call them editorial clamps. So just as an example, we don't have time to look at every detailed example, but as a really quick example, the end of the book of Hosea in chapter 14, verse 7, for example, has this extensive use of agricultural terms and imagery. And then the early verses of Joel, we have agricultural imagery as well. But if you also skip over Joel into Amos, you'll find agricultural imagery there as well. Right? So what it looks like is somebody took the book of Joel, added that agricultural imagery at the beginning of it, and then inserted it as a response to the concluding scenes of Hosea chapter 14. So one of the features we find that suggests unity are these intentional incidences of editing. Another thing that suggests unity is common themes. There's a number of theological themes, and later in this course, we're going to explore many of these. There are a number of common themes or pieces of imagery that flow through all of these books in interesting ways and kind of bind them together. For example, the theology of the land, progressive description of Israel and Judah's relationship to foreign nations. There's sort of a history, and in a later class, we're actually going to explore this in great detail. There's sort of a history that runs through all of these 12 books. The theme of justice and return to God is a key theme that we're going to explore later in this course. The theme of theodicy and hope, or suffering and hope, which we're going to explore later in this class. Covenant themes recur all through this book. For example, you're going to find the use of Exodus chapter 34, verses 6 to 7, which some people call the character credo, where it's like a summary of God's character. That's actually found in Jonah. It's found in Nahum. It repeats through these different books. There's also a deep connection to the question of exile and return and God's covenant with his people, and the post-exilic community and their unsure status in relationship to the covenant. So we're going to find this theme of covenant that flows all the way through. One really important theme that actually is found almost uniformly in the book of the 12 and nowhere else is the theme of the day of the Lord, this day of God's profound and dramatic intervention. So we're going to explore these themes later in this course so that you can see what I mean when I say we find these themes flowing through the book of the 12. Another issue that we see in the book of the 12 is what we call narrative unity, which I've sort of mentioned already. The 12 tells a story of sorts of Israel and Judah, the divided kingdoms, beginning sometime in the 8th century, more or less, down into the Middle Persian period, which is in the 6th and 5th century. It tells us in narrative order, though perhaps not in the order that the books were actually created. So all of this together suggests to us one unified collection, the Book of the 12. So in this course, we're inviting you to journey with us through these books that you might already know a little bit, but to imagine them in this new light as a unified collection that presents us with God's revelation in a set of fascinating, complex, interlocking themes that unfold over the course of the 12 books that are actually one book. We hope that this journey can inspire and challenge and, even surprise you a little bit.